The first thing Commander Jake Morrison noticed about the civilian briefing officer wasn't her Hermes watch or the way she commanded the room without raising her voice. It was how she traced the mission coordinates on the tactical display with the precision of someone who had memorized every mountain ridge, every thermal updraft, every blind spot in enemy radar coverage. The woman standing before SEAL Team 6 wore a tailored blazer that probably cost more than his annual salary, but something in her eyes suggested she'd seen combat from angles these operators never would. "Ma'am, with all due respect," Morrison interrupted, his tone carrying the subtle condescension reserved for Pentagon civilians, "we appreciate the intelligence briefing, but we'll handle tactical aviation support through normal channels." The other operators shifted in their chairs, some smirking. They'd seen plenty of defense contractors with more money than sense trying to insert themselves into operational planning. Katerina Viper, Achafer didn't blink. At 38, she'd built Achafer Aerospace from a garage startup into a defense empire worth $3 billion, but that wasn't what made her dangerous. What made her dangerous was the way she could read weather patterns like sheet music and calculate flight dynamics in her head, while most pilots were still reaching for their calculators. "Commander Morrison," she said, her Nigerian accent barely detectable after 2 decades in American boardrooms and cockpits, "your normal channels just failed. Satellite imagery shows a massive storm system moving in 12 hours ahead of schedule. Your insertion window closes in 6 hours, not 18. She touched the screen, zooming in on meteorological data that made Morrison's confidence waver. "Your pilots will hit Category 4 winds at 12,000 feet. The thermals alone will tear apart standard approach vectors." The room fell silent. Morrison studied the weather projection, his jaw tightening as he recognized the accuracy of her assessment. Outside, the Nevada desert stretched endlessly under a deceptively clear sky, but Viper was showing them a different truth, one written in atmospheric pressure gradients and wind shear patterns that could turn a routine insertion into a death sentence. "What are you suggesting?" Morrison asked, his tone shifting almost imperceptibly from dismissal to attention. Something in the way she handled the tactical display, the casual familiarity with military terminology, suggested this woman was more than another defense contractor playing war games with taxpayer money. Viper smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Only the cold calculation of someone who had already run every possible scenario and found them all wanting, except one. "I'm suggesting you let someone fly who actually knows these skis, Commander. Someone who helped write the manual your pilots are still trying to memorize." She paused, letting the implication settle. "Someone who's been waiting 20 years for a mission exactly like this one." The photograph Morrison noticed on her briefing materials wasn't from a corporate headshot session. It was a woman in flight gear standing beside an FA-18 Super Hornet, her helmet tucked under one arm and the Pacific Ocean stretching behind her. The smile was younger, hungrier, but the eyes were identical, the eyes of someone who had touched the edge of the atmosphere and found it wanting. Lieutenant Commander Rodriguez, Morrison's intelligence officer, leaned forward. "Ma'am, your file shows civilian status for the past 15 years, current military aviation certification." His question carried the weight of regulations and liability, but also genuine curiosity. Something about Viper's bearing suggested capabilities that transcended paperwork. "Expired," Viper admitted without hesitation. "Along with my security clearance, my carrier qualification, and officially, my association with anything that could put ordnance on target from 30,000 feet." She gestured to the mission parameters displayed on the wall screen. "But mountain flying in Afghanistan doesn't expire. Neither does instrument rating in zero visibility. And neither does knowing exactly how much punishment an airframe can take before it stops being an aircraft and becomes a very expensive meteorite." The room temperature seemed to drop several degrees. These were men accustomed to operating in environments where the margin between success and catastrophe could be measured in milliseconds, and they recognized the voice of someone who had lived in that same space, but from a completely different angle. Morrison found himself recalculating everything he thought he knew about the woman standing before them. Defense contractors didn't usually speak with the casual intimacy of someone who had personally tested the structural limits of military aircraft. They definitely didn't reference specific combat theaters with the unconscious familiarity of someone who had been there when the shooting started. "What's your call sign?" The question came from Chief Petty Officer Williams, the team's senior enlisted advisor. It was asked quietly, almost respectfully, as if he already suspected the answer would change everything. Viper's expression shifted, becoming something harder and more distant. For a moment, the polished businesswoman disappeared entirely, replaced by someone who had earned her name in ways that left scars invisible to medical examinations. "Viper," she said simply. "Strike Fighter Squadron 103, USS Abraham Lincoln, Operation Enduring Freedom. 96 combat sorties, 0 losses." She paused, her gaze finding each operator in turn. "Until the day I prove that some battles can't be won by following orders, and some orders shouldn't be followed by anyone with a conscience." The silence that followed wasn't the uncomfortable quiet of a briefing room full of skeptical operators. It was the profound stillness that accompanied the recognition that everything had just changed, and none of them were entirely certain what that meant. Morrison stared at the mission timeline, his mind racing through implications that extended far beyond weather patterns and insertion windows. If Viper was who she claimed to be, if she was the pilot who had walked away from a decorated career under circumstances that remained classified, then this wasn't just about getting his team to their target coordinates. This was about understanding why someone who had owned the skis above Afghanistan would spend 15 years building an aerospace empire, only to volunteer for what appeared to be a suicide mission in weather that would challenge pilots half her age with twice her recent flight time. "The target," Morrison said carefully, studying the satellite imagery with new eyes. "You've been there before." It wasn't a question. Viper nodded once, a sharp acknowledgement that carried the weight of unfinished business. Different war, same mountains, same mistakes. She traced a flight path on the display with movements that suggested muscle memory from countless mission briefings. "Except this time, I'm not taking orders from someone who thinks maps and satellites tell the whole story." The tactical display showed their target, a fortified compound nestled in terrain so hostile that conventional air support would be ineffective and standard insertion protocols bordered on suicidal. But Viper was studying the topography with the focused intensity of someone reading a familiar book, looking for details that might have changed since the last time she'd committed every ridge and valley to memory. "What happened?" Rodriguez asked quietly. 15 years ago, what happened that made you walk away?" Viper's smile was bitter, carrying the weight of decisions that had cost everything and saved everyone. "I learned the difference between following orders and completing the mission, and I learned that sometimes you can't do both." She straightened, the businesswoman returning but not entirely hiding the pilot who still lived beneath the surface. "This time, gentlemen, there are no orders to follow, only a mission to complete." Morrison exchanged glances with his team members, recognizing the moment when operational parameters shifted from routine to unprecedented. They were looking at a woman who had walked away from everything: career, pension, the brotherhood of military aviation, and spent 15 years building the resources to ensure she'd never be in a position where she had to choose between conscience and command again. The weather satellite data continued updating in real time, confirming Viper's assessment with meteorological precision that made standard flight planning look like wishful thinking. The storm system was massive, unpredictable, and moving faster than any forecast had predicted. In 6 hours, these mountains would be a death trap for conventional aircraft. But Viper wasn't looking at the weather display anymore. She was studying the faces of the operators around the table, reading their expressions with the same analytical precision she brought to atmospheric conditions and tactical planning. Williams cleared his throat, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had survived more combat deployments than he cared to count. "Ma'am, what exactly are you proposing? Because if you're talking about flying into that weather system, you're talking about conditions that would ground every pilot in the Air Force." "I'm talking about flying conditions I helped establish protocols for," Viper replied calmly. "Back when protocols were written by people who had actually tested the limits, not by committee members who thought flight simulators provided adequate data." She gestured toward the mission parameters. "Your insertion point requires precision flying through mountain passes in zero visibility with winds that will change direction every 30 seconds. It requires someone who doesn't just know the aircraft specifications, someone who knows exactly how far beyond those specifications the airframe will actually perform." Morrison felt the familiar weight of command decisions that carried consequences far beyond the immediate mission. His team was trained for impossible operations, but they depended on support elements that functioned within established parameters. What Viper was proposing existed in the gray area between standard operating procedure and the kind of improvisation that either saved lives or ended careers. "Your aircraft," Rodriguez said, studying the technical specifications Viper had provided. "It's not military standard. Custom modifications, proprietary systems, no maintenance records in our database." He looked up from his tablet. "How do we know it'll perform when everything goes to hell?" Viper's expression shifted to something that might have been amusement if it hadn't been so predatory. "Because I designed it for when everything goes to hell. Because every modification was tested in conditions that make this mission look like a training exercise." She paused, letting that sink in. "And because 15 years ago, I learned that sometimes you have to build your own solution when the standard options are designed by people who never have to use them." The implications hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire. They were being offered support from someone who had walked away from military aviation at the height of her career, spent 15 years building the resources to return on her own terms, and was now volunteering to fly a mission that would challenge the limits of both human and mechanical endurance. Morrison studied the mission clock, watching their window narrow with each passing minute. In the military, decisions like this came with layers of oversight, chains of command, and carefully documented risk assessments. But they were operating in a space where standard procedures had already failed, and conventional wisdom was proving inadequate to the challenge. The photograph on Viper's briefing materials drew his attention again, not the corporate headshots, but the faded image of a younger woman standing beside a fighter jet. The aircraft behind her showed signs of hard use: maintenance panels slightly discolored from repeated removal, landing gear that suggested countless carrier landings, and the subtle wear patterns that marked a machine pushed to its absolute limits on a regular basis. Chief Williams had served long enough to recognize the signs of someone who had operated in environments where survival depended on capabilities that couldn't be taught in training programs. "Ma'am," he said respectfully, "what aren't you telling us about this mission? Because someone doesn't build a $3 billion company just to volunteer for a one-way ticket into the worst weather system we've seen in 5 years." Viper's composure cracked slightly, revealing something raw and unhealed beneath the polished exterior. "Because 15 years ago, I had to watch good people die because someone in an air-conditioned office decided that following regulations was more important than adapting to battlefield reality." Her voice carried the weight of memory and the sharp edge of unresolved anger. "And because this time, I'm not going to watch from the sidelines while someone else makes decisions that get operators killed." The room fell silent except for the quiet hum of electronic equipment and the distant sound of aircraft operations continuing outside their bubble of crisis planning. Morrison realized they had crossed an invisible line. from a routine briefing about logistical support to something far more personal and infinitely more dangerous. Rodriguez was studying satellite imagery with the focused intensity of someone trying to solve a puzzle with missing pieces. "The target compound," he said slowly. "Intelligence suggests it's been abandoned for months. Why risk everything to insert a team into an empty facility?" He looked up from his screen. "Unless intelligence is wrong. Unless there's something there that's worth flying into a Category 4 storm system." Viper nodded once, a sharp acknowledgement that carried implications none of them were entirely prepared to process. "Intelligence is incomplete. It always is." She touched the tactical display, highlighting structures that were barely visible in satellite imagery. "But some things can't be confirmed by satellites or signal intercepts. Some things require getting close enough to see details that don't show up in reconnaissance photos." Morrison felt the familiar tension that preceded operations where the intelligence picture was fragmentary and the margin for error was essentially non-existent. His team was accustomed to working with incomplete information, but this felt different, more personal, more urgent, and significantly more dangerous than standard briefings suggested. "What details?" he asked quietly. Viper's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. The kind that explained why someone would spend 15 years building the resources to fly one more mission. The kind that make following orders impossible and completing the mission the only thing that matters. She paused, studying their faces with the analytical precision of someone evaluating assets under extreme pressure. The kind that some battles never really end. They just wait for the right person to finish them. The mission parameters suddenly seemed less like a tactical challenge and more like a reckoning that had been 15 years in the making. Morrison realized they weren't just looking at logistical support from a defense contractor. They were looking at someone who had been preparing for this specific moment since the day she walked away from military aviation, and who had built an empire for the sole purpose of ensuring she'd never again be powerless when the shooting started. Williams checked his watch, a gesture that had become habitual during decades of operations where timing could determine survival. "Ma'am, if we're doing this, we need to move. That weather system isn't going to wait for us to finish talking." His tone carried the practical urgency of someone who had learned to recognize when discussion time was over and action time had begun. Viper was already moving toward the door, her movements carrying the controlled efficiency of someone transitioning from planning to execution. "My aircraft is fueled and ready. Flight plan filed under civilian charter, which gives us flexibility military flights don't have." She paused at the threshold, turning back to face the operators who were still processing the implications of what they'd agreed to. "Gentlemen, I need you to understand something. Where we're going, there are no standard operating procedures, no backup plans, no extraction protocols if things go wrong." Morrison stood, his decision crystallizing with the weight of command responsibility and the recognition that some missions existed beyond the comfortable boundaries of regulation and oversight. "What there is." Viper's expression shifted to something that was part anticipation and part resignation, the look of someone who had been waiting 15 years for the opportunity to settle accounts that had been left unfinished. "What there is, Commander, is the chance to do something right. Finally." The Nevada desert stretched endlessly beyond the briefing room windows, its deceptive calm masking the storm system that was already beginning to reshape weather patterns across 3 states. In 6 hours, the mountains that formed their target area would be shrouded in conditions that challenged the limits of both human endurance and mechanical reliability. But Viper was looking past the immediate tactical challenges to something that existed in the space between memory and mission completion. As the operators filed out to gather their equipment, Morrison caught a glimpse of something in Viper's expression that he'd seen before in the faces of people who had carried invisible wounds for too long. It was the look of someone who had found a way to transform old pain into present purpose, and who was finally in a position to even the scales of a battle that had been lost long before most people knew it had been fought. The mission clock continued its relentless countdown, but Morrison no longer felt like they were racing against weather conditions and insertion windows. They were racing against the accumulated weight of 15 years' worth of unfinished business, and the growing certainty that some debts could only be paid in the thin air above mountains where the margin between success and disaster was measured in heartbeats and decisions that couldn't be undone. Rodriguez secured his equipment with movements that had become automatic through countless deployments, but his mind was processing implications that extended far beyond standard operational parameters. "Chief," he said quietly to Williams, "what do you think we're really walking into?" Williams paused in his preparation, considering the question with the analytical precision of someone who had survived more combat operations than he cared to count. "I think we're walking into someone else's war, Rodriguez. Someone who's been fighting it for 15 years and finally figured out how to win it." He resumed packing his gear, but his movements carried a different quality now, the careful precision of someone preparing for an operation where the usual rules might not apply. Outside, the sound of aircraft engines warming up provided a constant background rhythm that seemed to match the increasing urgency of their preparation. Viper's aircraft waited on the tarmac like a predator preparing to hunt, sleek, modified, and carrying capabilities that existed in the gray area between cutting-edge technology and the kind of improvements that could only be developed by someone who had personally tested the limits of conventional design. Morrison completed his equipment check and moved toward the aircraft, his mind already shifting into the focused state that preceded high-risk operations. But something about this mission felt different from the beginning, not just the unusual support arrangement or the challenging weather conditions, but the sense that they were participants in something larger and more personal than standard tactical objectives suggested. As they approached the aircraft, Morrison caught sight of Viper conducting her pre-flight inspection with movements that suggested muscle memory from thousands of similar preparations. But her attention to detail went beyond standard procedure. She was examining components and systems with the focused intensity of someone whose life had been saved by catching mechanical problems that other pilots might have missed. "Viper," he called, using her call sign naturally for the first time. "How long since you've flown in conditions like what we're heading into?" She looked up from her inspection, and for a moment her expression showed something vulnerable beneath the professional competence. "Every day for 15 years, Commander, in simulators, test flights, and conditions that push every limitation I can safely exceed." She gestured toward the aircraft. "The question isn't whether I can fly in this weather. The question is whether you're ready to discover what's waiting for us when we get there." The engine spooled up to operational power, creating a sound that was simultaneously familiar and subtly different from standard military aircraft. Morrison realized that Viper hadn't just modified the airframe. She had rebuilt it from the ground up, incorporating improvements that could only come from someone who understood not just how aircraft were supposed to perform, but how they actually behaved when pushed beyond designed limitations. As they prepared for takeoff, Morrison found himself wondering if they were making the biggest mistake of their careers, or if they were finally getting the kind of support that could make impossible missions merely improbable. The distinction might not matter until they were already committed to a flight path that would take them into weather conditions that existed on the edge of survival, guided by someone who had spent 15 years preparing for exactly this moment. The Nevada desert fell away beneath them as they climbed toward clouds that seemed to stretch to the edge of the atmosphere, and Morrison realized that, whatever they found at their destination, the return trip would bring them back as different people than they had been when they left. Some missions changed the people who survived them, and this felt like one of those missions, the kind that existed in the space between standard operations and legend. Viper's voice came through their headsets with the calm professionalism of someone who had made this transition countless times before, but Morrison caught an undertone that suggested this flight was different for her as well. After 15 years of building toward this moment, she was finally returning to the element where she had earned her reputation and her regrets in equal measure. Gentlemen, her voice carried clearly through the intercom system, welcome to conditions that don't exist in your training manuals. For the next 4 hours, physics is optional and imagination is mandatory. The aircraft responded to her inputs with a precision that suggested complete integration between pilot and machine. Try to enjoy the ride. It's going to be the last predictable thing that happens today. The storm system loomed ahead of them like a wall of churning darkness that stretched from the ground to altitudes where commercial aircraft feared to venture. But Viper was flying toward it with the focused determination of someone who had spent 15 years learning how to navigate conditions that existed beyond the comfortable margins of standard procedures. Morrison secured his equipment one final time and settled in for a flight that would either validate everything he thought he knew about tactical aviation support or teach him lessons that could only be learned by someone who had survived what they were about to attempt. Either way, he was beginning to understand that they weren't just passengers on this flight. They were witnesses to someone settling accounts that had been 15 years in the making. The last thing Morrison saw before they entered the storm was the way Viper's hands moved across the controls with the unconscious precision of someone who had never really left the cockpit, despite 15 years in boardrooms and corporate offices. She was home in a way that suggested all the success and wealth had been secondary to the simple fact that some people were born to fly, and some battles could only be fought from 30,000 feet above the people who thought they understood the cost of victory. As the aircraft began to shake with the first effects of severe turbulence, Morrison realized they were no longer just operators on a tactical mission. They were witnesses to someone's return to the element that had defined her, shaped her, and ultimately forced her to choose between following orders and saving lives. The storm ahead would test every skill Viper had developed over 2 decades of flight experience. But Morrison was beginning to suspect the real test would come when they reached their destination and discovered what had been important enough to risk everything to find. The mountains rose around them like ancient sentinels, their peaks disappearing into cloud cover that moved with the violent unpredictability of weather systems that existed beyond human control. But Viper was navigating through conditions that would have grounded less experienced pilots, her movements suggesting an understanding of atmospheric dynamics that went beyond technical training to something approaching intuitive mastery. "Storms worse than projected," Rodriguez observed, his voice tight with the kind of tension that accompanied recognition of danger that couldn't be avoided, only endured. "Storms exactly what I expected," Viper replied calmly. "Weather services base projections on historical data and computer models. Mountains create their own weather, and these mountains have been creating the same patterns for 15 years. Her voice carried the confidence of someone who had learned to read conditions that didn't appear in meteorological textbooks. "We're not flying through a storm, gentlemen. We're flying through a battlefield where the terrain has been fighting the same war longer than any of us have been alive." The aircraft bucked and rolled through turbulence that seemed to come from every direction simultaneously, but Viper's responses were smooth, precise, and seemingly anticipatory. Morrison realized she wasn't just reacting to conditions. She was reading patterns and predicting changes with the kind of situational awareness that could only be developed through extensive experience in similar environments. "Target area in 20 minutes, Williams reported, his voice steady despite conditions that were testing the limits of both human and mechanical endurance. "Visibility near zero, wind speeds exceeding safe parameters for standard insertion." "Define safe," Viper replied with something that might have been humor if the circumstances had been less extreme. "Because where we're going, safety is a relative concept that depends more on skill than on regulations." The aircraft responded to her inputs with a precision that suggested complete integration between pilot and machine. "Besides, Chief, you didn't come this far to play it safe. You came this far to complete a mission that can't be completed safely." Morrison studied the terrain below through brief breaks in the cloud cover, catching glimpses of mountains that seemed to stretch infinitely in every direction. The landscape was harsh, unforgiving, and utterly indifferent to human presence. The kind of terrain that had been consuming aircraft and crews for decades without leaving any trace of their passage. But Viper was flying through these conditions with the focused intensity of someone who had spent years learning how to survive in environments that existed beyond the margins of standard procedures. Every adjustment she made was precise, economical, and seemingly effortless. The kind of flying that made dangerous conditions look routine and impossible maneuvers appear natural. "There," she said quietly, her voice carrying a different quality now, something between recognition and resignation. "Target compound, bearing 270, distance 8 kilometers." The aircraft banked smoothly despite turbulence that should have made precision flying impossible. "Gentlemen, welcome to the place where some wars never end. They just wait for the right people to finish them." Morrison peered through the storm toward coordinates that had existed in intelligence files for months, but had never been verified by direct observation. What he saw through breaks in the weather made his blood run cold, and his understanding of their mission shift fundamentally. The compound below wasn't abandoned. It was active, heavily defended, and occupied by forces that intelligence agencies had declared neutralized months ago. But Viper was flying toward it with the grim determination of someone who had expected exactly this situation, and who had spent 15 years preparing to deal with it. "Intel was wrong," Rodriguez said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of recognition that their mission parameters had just changed from routine to catastrophic. "Intel was incomplete," Viper corrected, her tone carrying the sharp edge of someone who had learned not to trust information that came from people who had never been shot at. "Intel is always incomplete when the people gathering it have never been close enough to see what's actually happening." She adjusted their flight path with movements that suggested she had been planning for exactly these conditions. But some things can't be confirmed by satellites or signal intercepts. Some things require getting close enough to count the bodies. The storm system was reaching peak intensity around them, creating conditions that challenged every aspect of flight operations from basic navigation to mechanical reliability. But Viper was flying through chaos with the kind of precision that suggested she had been born for exactly these moments, when survival depended on skills that couldn't be taught and instincts that could only be developed through exposure to conditions that most people wouldn't survive. As they approached the insertion point, Morrison realized that whatever intelligence briefings had prepared them for, the reality on the ground was going to be significantly more complex and infinitely more dangerous than anyone had anticipated. But they were committed now to a course of action that would take them into the heart of a situation that existed far beyond the comfortable boundaries of standard military operations. The compound below emerged from the storm like a fortress that had been designed to withstand everything nature and human conflict could produce. But Viper was studying it with the analytical precision of someone who had been thinking about this moment for 15 years, and who finally had the resources and opportunity to settle accounts that had been left unfinished since the day she walked away from military aviation. Morrison checked his equipment one final time and prepared for an insertion that would take them into the kind of environment where survival depended on capabilities that existed beyond training manuals and standard procedures. Whatever they found on the ground, he was beginning to understand that this mission was as much about Viper's unfinished business as it was about their operational objectives. The aircraft shuddered through final approach conditions that would have been impossible for conventional military aviation, but Viper was flying with the focused determination of someone who had spent 15 years preparing for exactly this moment. As they descended toward coordinates that existed in the gap between intelligence reports and battlefield reality, Morrison realized they were about to discover why some battles never end. They just wait for the right people to finish them. The landing zone materialized out of the storm like something from a fever dream, a narrow strip of relatively flat ground surrounded by terrain that seemed designed to prevent any form of human access. But Viper was approaching it with the kind of precision that suggested she had been planning this landing for years, taking into account every variable from wind patterns to ground composition that could affect their ability to get his team safely to their objective. 30 seconds, she announced, her voice carrying the calm professionalism of someone who had made countless similar approaches in conditions that existed on the edge of survivability. Gentlemen, when you step out of this aircraft, you're stepping into someone else's war, someone who's been fighting it longer than you've been operators, and someone who's been losing it because they didn't have the right kind of support. The aircraft touched down with barely perceptible contact, despite conditions that should have made any landing impossible. Morrison realized that Viper wasn't just an exceptional pilot. She was someone who had transcended the normal limitations of human capability through a combination of skill, experience, and the kind of determination that could only be forged through surviving the kind of loss that changed people forever. As his team prepared to disembark, Morrison caught one last glimpse of Viper's expression in the cockpit display lighting. What he saw wasn't the face of a successful businesswoman or a decorated veteran. It was the face of someone who had finally found a way to even the scales of a battle that had been lost long before most people knew it had been fought, and who was prepared to risk everything to ensure that this time, the outcome would be different. The storm raged around them as they moved toward their objective, but Morrison was beginning to understand that the real storm had been building for 15 years in the mind of someone who had never forgotten the cost of following orders when conscience demanded a different course of action. Whatever they found in the compound ahead, it would be the culmination of a war that had been fought in boardrooms and corporate offices as much as it had been fought in the mountains of Afghanistan. And for the first time since the mission began, Morrison was beginning to understand that they weren't just operators completing an objective. They were witnesses to someone's return to a battlefield where the stakes were personal, the margins were non-existent, and the only acceptable outcome was the kind of victory that could finally put old ghosts to rest.